When 46-year-old tech billionaire Hathaway Sterling parked his $500,000 Maybach outside a crumbling Brooklyn brownstone, he had one pathetic goal: to humiliate his black ex-wife, Maya Caldwell, in front of his new 23-year-old fiancée. Armed with a $50,000 hush-money check and a smug grin, Hathaway was ready to force Maya into signing away the last legal remnants of their past. He expected tears, squalor, and a pathetic apology from the woman he had ruthlessly discarded 5 years ago. But arrogance is a dangerous blindfold. Hathaway had no idea he wasn't walking into a house of poverty. He was stepping onto a meticulously rigged landmine that was about to completely vaporize his $4 billion empire in less than 30 minutes. The sleek, obsidian black 2025 Mercedes Maybach S680 looked like an alien spaceship idling against the cracked, uneven pavement of McDonough Street in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon in late October. The autumn wind kicked up a swirl of dead leaves and bodega wrappers, plastering them momentarily against the car's heavily tinted windows. Inside the climate-controlled, soundproof cabin, Hathaway Sterling adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He was a man who looked exactly like what a mid-40s Silicon Valley success story was supposed to look like. Sharp jawline, salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, teeth bleached to a blinding white, and an aura of relentless, predatory confidence. He was the founder and CEO of Sterling Data Solutions, a cloud infrastructure company that had just gone public 2 months prior, minting him a net worth of $1.4 billion. Sitting beside him was Grace DuPont. She was 23, an Instagram influencer whose primary talent was looking expensive. She wore a pristine white Chanel tweed jacket, her slender wrists weighed down by a stack of Cartier Love bracelets that jingled every time she swiped on her phone. "Babe, are you sure we have the right address?" Grace asked, her perfectly glossed lips twisting in a mixture of confusion and disgust. She peered through the glass at the row of aging brownstones. Many of them were beautiful, but the specific address they were parked in front of, number 412, looked undeniably exhausted. The paint on the front door was peeling, the iron railing leading up the stoop was rusted, and the small patch of front garden was overgrown with stubborn weeds. "This is it," Hathaway said, a cruel, nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "This is exactly where I left her." He was talking about Maya Caldwell, his ex-wife. 10 years ago, Hathaway and Maya had been a team. They had met in a cramped graduate school library. He, a cutthroat business major, she, a brilliant software engineer with a mind that worked in algorithms and architecture. Maya, a striking black woman with a quiet, unshakable dignity, had spent countless nights writing the foundational code for what would eventually become the backbone of Sterling Data Solutions. They had married young, poor, and full of ambition. But as the company began to attract its first $1 million in venture capital, Hathaway's perspective shifted. He started attending high society galas, rubbing shoulders with generational wealth. He decided that Maya, who preferred comfortable sweaters to designer gowns, who would rather debug a server than network with venture capitalists at Nobu, was no longer a fit for the life he was building. When the divorce came 5 years ago, Hathaway had hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. They had buried Maya in paperwork, ultimately forcing her to sign an agreement that left her with a paltry sum and the deed to this exact, dilapidated Brooklyn brownstone, which they had bought as a fixer-upper right before the split. "It's just depressing," Grace sighed, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "Why didn't you just have your lawyers mail her the document? Why do we have to physically be in this neighborhood? I feel like someone is going to steal the hubcaps." Because, my love, Hathaway said, turning to stroke Grace's cheek. Lawyers can't guarantee she won't hire some cheap attorney to delay the process. Sterling Data is in the final stages of a massive merger with Apex Global. The due diligence team found a tiny, insignificant loophole in the original IP transfer from 5 years ago. It's a ghost in the machine, a technicality. But Apex wants it closed. I need Maya to sign a simple quitclaim deed releasing any retroactive rights to the legacy code. He paused, his eyes drifting back to the peeling front door. And honestly, I want to see her face. I want her to see me, to see you, and to understand exactly what she lost when she refused to keep up with me. Hathaway tapped the glass partition. The driver, a stoic man named Thomas, put the car in park. Let's go get this over with, Hathaway said, grabbing a sleek leather folder from the seat. Keep your purse close, Grace. Grace stepped out of the Maybach, her red-soled Louboutins wobbling precariously on the uneven Brooklyn sidewalk. She immediately pinched her nose, though the air merely smelled of roasted nuts from a nearby street cart and impending rain. Hathaway walked with the swagger of a conqueror, leading the way up the crumbling concrete stairs of the stoop. He noticed a slight crack in one of the steps and scoffed. 5 years, and she couldn't even afford to fix the stairs. It validated every choice he had ever made. He had become a titan of industry. She had faded into absolute obscurity. He hadn't seen her face or heard her voice since the day the judge finalized the divorce. He raised his fist and knocked firmly on the heavy, weathered wooden door. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of distant traffic. Grace sighed heavily, crossing her arms. Maybe she had to take an extra shift at whatever diner she works at. The deadbolt clicked. The heavy door groaned open. Maya Caldwell stood in the threshold. Hathaway felt a sudden, involuntary tightening in his chest. He had expected to see a broken woman. He expected exhaustion, premature aging, perhaps the faded bitterness of a scorned ex-wife. Instead, Maya looked radiant. She was 38, but her skin was flawless, glowing with a deep, healthy warmth. Her thick natural hair was pulled back into an elegant, effortless puff. She wasn't wearing rags. She was dressed in a pair of loose, flowing, cream-colored linen trousers and a soft, cashmere turtleneck that, while lacking visible logos, draped beautifully over her frame. She looked at Hathaway, her dark eyes completely devoid of the shock or intimidation he had craved. Her gaze then slowly slid to Grace, taking in the Chanel, the Cartier, the defensive posture. "Hathaway," Maya said. Her voice was smooth, a rich alto that commanded the space without needing to raise its volume. "To what do I owe the intrusion?" "Hello, Maya," Hathaway said, recovering his composure and puffing out his chest. "It's been a long time. You're looking exactly the same." "I wish I could say the same for you," Maya replied calmly, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on his visibly whitened teeth and the slight stiffness of his tailored jacket. "You look like you're trying very hard." Grace bristled, stepping forward to link her arm possessively through Hathaway's. "I'm Grace," she chirped, her voice intentionally pitched higher. "Hathaway's fiancée. He told me so much about you. Well, not much, really. Just that you used to be married before he became successful." Maya offered Grace a slow, almost pitying smile. "A pleasure, Grace. It's always fascinating to meet Hathaway's reflections." "Reflections?" Grace frowned, confused by the vocabulary. "Never mind her, sweetheart," Hathaway interrupted smoothly. He held up the leather folder. "Maya, I don't want to take up your day. I know you probably have errands to run, or whatever it is you do now, but I need to speak with you regarding a minor legal formality. It requires your signature." Maya didn't reach for the folder. She kept her hands resting comfortably in the pockets of her linen trousers. A legal formality that requires the billionaire CEO of sterling data to hand-deliver it to Bedford-Stuyvesant? Your lawyers must be terribly underpaid if they're outsourcing courier work to you. Hathaway's jaw tightened. He hated that she wasn't bowing to the spectacle of the Maybach idling behind them. It's a sensitive document, Maya. I preferred to handle it personally. Can we step inside? Or is the living room currently a construction zone? He looked pointedly at the peeling paint on the doorframe. Maya paused. A strange, fleeting spark danced in her eyes, a look of deep, private amusement. Of course, Maya said, stepping back and pulling the door wide open. Please, come into my home. Hathaway stepped over the threshold, pulling Grace behind him, fully preparing himself for the smell of mildew and the sight of thrift store furniture. The entry hallway was dark, illuminated only by a single bulb. The walls here were indeed stripped, showing raw lath and plaster. "Watch your step, babe," Hathaway whispered to Grace, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't touch the walls." Maya led them down the narrow, dimly lit corridor toward the back of the house. "Mind the dust in the entryway. The Preservation Society has very strict rules about how I restore the original 1890s facade." They turned the corner into the main living space, and Hathaway stopped dead in his tracks. The air left his lungs. Grace's jaw literally dropped, a small gasp escaping her glossed lips. The back of the brownstone had been completely hollowed out and transformed into a staggering, multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece. The ceiling soared 20 feet high, crowned by a massive structural glass skylight that flooded the room with natural, diffused autumn light. The walls were original exposed brick, but they had been painstakingly restored and sealed, serving as the backdrop for massive, vibrant pieces of original contemporary art, pieces Hathaway recognized from his trips to Art Basel. The floor was wide plank, reclaimed French oak. In the center of the room sat a sprawling, custom-built, curved sofa, upholstered in deep emerald velvet, facing a sleek, modern fireplace suspended from the ceiling. Beyond the living area was a kitchen that rivaled anything Hathaway had in his Manhattan penthouse. Dramatic slabs of imported black Calacatta marble, matte black custom cabinetry, and a gleaming, professional-grade La Marzocco espresso machine. Through a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling retractable glass doors at the back, Hathaway could see a lush, meticulously landscaped private courtyard, featuring a Japanese koi pond and a modern fire pit. This wasn't a dilapidated fixer-upper. This was a stealth wealth fortress. It was a property that, in this rapidly gentrifying market, easily commanded $8 or $9 million. "Please, have a seat at the table," Maya said, gesturing to a stunning, live-edge walnut dining table surrounded by Hans Wegner wishbone chairs. Hathaway was experiencing profound cognitive dissonance. He walked toward the table, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for a crack in the facade. A sign of cheapness. A tell. But there was none. The acoustics of the room were perfectly dampened. The air smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood and fresh eucalyptus. "Maya," Hathaway started, his voice losing its polished edge. "What? How did you pay for all of this? This renovation? This is millions of dollars." "I work, Hathaway," Maya said simply. She walked into the kitchen and began preparing hot water in a copper kettle. "Can I offer either of you tea? I have a lovely first flush Darjeeling." "No. No tea," Hathaway snapped, quickly regaining his footing. He pulled out a chair and sat down, dropping the leather folder onto the walnut wood. He had to regain control of the narrative. So what if she took out massive loans to renovate the house? She was probably drowning in debt, leveraging the property to the hilt just to play pretend. That's it, he reasoned. She's house poor. She's desperate. Grace sat next to him, running her hand nervously over the smooth wood of the table. She looked significantly less confident now, her eyes darting between her Cartier bracelets and the museum-quality abstract painting hanging on the brick wall. Maya walked over, carrying a single delicate bone china teacup for herself. She sat opposite Hathaway, crossing her legs gracefully. So, the legal formality. Hathaway opened the folder. As you may have read in the Wall Street Journal, Sterling Data Solutions had a highly successful IPO. We are currently finalizing an acquisition by Apex Global. I am aware, Maya said, blowing softly on her tea. A $4.2 billion valuation. Congratulations, Hathaway. You finally got your castle in the sky. Yes. Well, Hathaway cleared his throat, pushing a thick stack of stapled papers across the table. During the due diligence phase, Apex's lawyers flagged a tiny anomaly. When we divorced, you signed away your equity in the company. However, the foundational algorithm, the core predictive data sorting code, was technically authored by you before the company was officially incorporated. Maya took a slow sip of her tea. The Aura algorithm. Yes, I remember writing it on a remarkably slow laptop in a freezing apartment while you were out networking. Right, Hathaway said, gritting his teeth. The original divorce settlement transferred all intellectual property to the company, but Apex wants an ironclad, supplementary non-disclosure and quitclaim agreement, specifically naming the Aura algorithm, just to ensure there are no phantom claims to the underlying architecture. It's a standard housekeeping measure. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek titanium pen, placing it on top of the document. Then he reached back into the folder and pulled out a certified cashier's check. He slid it across the table, placing it next to the pen. I know things must be tight, Hathaway said, his confidence returning as he tapped the check. And despite how things ended, I am not a cruel man. I'm offering you $50,000. Tax-free. Just sign the document, Maya. Take the money. Pay off some of the massive debt you clearly took on to build this room, and we never have to see each other again. Maya didn't look at the check. She didn't look at the pen. She looked at Hathaway, and then she looked at Grace. $50,000, Maya repeated. Her tone was completely unreadable. It's more than generous for a simple signature, Grace chimed in, trying to sound authoritative. Hathaway is doing you a massive favor. Maya slowly picked up the document. She didn't read it. She simply weighed the thick stack of paper in her hand, staring at the front page. You always were a terrible liar, Hathaway, Maya said softly. Hathaway frowned. Excuse me? You didn't come here because of a tiny anomaly, Maya said, setting the papers back down. Apex Global didn't flag a ghost in the machine. Apex Global halted the merger negotiations 3 days ago because their tech auditors realized that Sterling Data Solutions doesn't actually own the Aura algorithm at all. Hathaway's face drained of color. The smug, predatory confidence vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. Grace looked at him, confused by his sudden physical reaction. What are you talking about? Hathaway forced out, his voice suddenly hoarse. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the beautiful walnut table. When we divorced, I signed away my equity in Sterling Data Solutions. I signed away my rights to the branding, the client lists, and the corporate assets. But what your expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers failed to notice, because they didn't understand code, was that the Aura algorithm was never an asset of Sterling Data. It was a licensed utility. The room was deathly quiet. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator could be heard. I patented Aura under a separate holding company, registered in Delaware, 6 months before we even got married, Maya whispered, her eyes locking onto his. Sterling Data has been using it on a free, revocable, open-ended beta license for a decade, a license that, as of midnight last night, I officially revoked. Hathaway stared at her, the reality of her words hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. If Sterling Data didn't have Aura, the company was essentially an empty shell. The $4.2 billion valuation was built on stolen air. And $50,000, Maya said, finally glancing down at the check with a look of profound amusement. Won't even cover the legal fees for the cease and desist order my attorneys served your board of directors 10 minutes ago. Hathaway stared at Maya, his breath catching in his throat. The silence in the magnificent, sun-drenched living room was suddenly suffocating. He looked from Maya's perfectly calm face down to the $50,000 cashier's check resting on the walnut table, and then to the stack of legal documents his expensive team at Sullivan and Cromwell had urgently prepared. "You're bluffing," Hathaway said, though his voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin, desperate. "You can't patent code while employed by a company and claim it as your own. That violates every non-compete and IP assignment clause in California corporate law." "You're absolutely right, Hathaway," Maya said, taking another unhurried sip of her Darjeeling tea. "If I had written the Aura architecture while employed by Sterling Data Solutions, it would be your property. But as I recall, and as the incorporation documents clearly show, Sterling Data wasn't legally formed until March of 2014. She set her teacup down with a soft, deliberate clink. "I filed the patent for the Aura predictive sorting matrix in September of 2013, Maya continued, her voice echoing the precision of the code she wrote. "I filed it under a Delaware limited liability company called Onyx Innovations. I was the sole proprietor. When you officially incorporated Sterling Data, I granted the company a beta use, non-exclusive, revocable license for the framework. It was buried in the initial vendor agreements. You were so busy throwing launch parties in Palo Alto and trying to get your face in Forbes that you never actually read the foundational technical contracts. You just signed where I told you to sign." Grace, who had been aggressively silent, finally spoke up. Her eyes darted between Hathaway's pale face and Maya's serene one. "Babe, what is she talking about? What does revoked mean? The merger with Apex is still happening, right? We have the venue in Aspen booked for January." Hathaway ignored her. His hands began to tremble as he reached into the breast pocket of his Tom Ford suit and pulled out his iPhone. His thumb frantically swiped across the screen, dialing his general counsel, David Kensington. He put the phone on speaker, slamming it down onto the table. It rang once, twice. "Hathaway!" David's voice barked through the speaker. He sounded exhausted, completely stripped of his usual corporate bravado. "Tell me you didn't go to Brooklyn." "David, what the hell is happening?" Hathaway demanded, leaning over the phone. "I'm sitting here with Maya. She's spouting some absolute nonsense about Onyx Innovations and a revoked license. Tell me this is a minor snag." A heavy sigh crackled over the line. "Hathaway, she's not spouting nonsense. We've been tearing the archives apart since the Apex due diligence team flagged the IP discrepancy on Friday. We found the original vendor agreement from 2014. Sterling Data doesn't own the underlying architecture of the Aura algorithm. We never did. We had a license, and our servers just got hit with a digital cease and desist protocol at exactly midnight. We are legally barred from utilizing the core sorting matrix." "Then override it!" Hathaway screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Get the engineering team to patch it." We can't, David replied, his tone grim. Without the Aura Foundation, our entire cloud infrastructure collapses. It's the skeleton of our whole platform. Apex Global officially withdrew their acquisition offer an hour ago, Hathaway. They notified the SEC. The news is going to hit the wire before the market closes. Hathaway felt the room tilt. The $4.2 billion valuation, his net worth, his identity, his entire empire, was vanishing into thin air. He had spent the last 5 years believing he was a titan of industry, a visionary who had outgrown the quiet, brilliant woman who had built his foundation. In reality, he had been living in a house of cards, and Maya had just quietly removed the bottom floor. "Fix it, David," Hathaway choked out. "Throw money at it. Injunct her." "There's nothing to injunct," David said quietly. "She owns it, Hathaway. And we just lost our buyer. I have to go brief the board. Do not say another word to her without representation." The line went dead. The silence returned, heavier and colder than before. Grace slowly pushed her chair back from the table. The defensive, haughty posture she had carried into the house had completely evaporated. "Hathaway," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Does this mean? Are you broke?" "Shut up, Grace," Hathaway snapped, burying his face in his hands. Maya watched him, her expression devoid of the vindictive joy Hathaway would have expected. There was only a calm, clinical satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction a master architect feels when a building perfectly withstands a simulated earthquake. "5 years, Hathaway," Maya said, her voice cutting through his panic. 5 years ago, you sat across from me in a sterile mediation room and told me I was dead weight. You told me my lack of vision was holding you back. You handed me the deed to this ruined shell of a house and a modest alimony check, and you thought you had cleanly excised me from your life." Hathaway slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogant swagger of the billionaire CEO entirely stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, hollow man. "Why didn't you do this sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking. "If you had the power to kill the company, why wait half a decade? Because 5 years ago, sterling data was only worth $50 million, Maya stated matter-of-factly. Destroying you then wouldn't have taught you anything. You would have just pivoted, raised more venture capital, and started another tech bro grift. I needed you to build it higher. I needed you to take it public. I needed you to get so close to an astronomical, multi-billion-dollar payday that you could taste it. I wanted you to feel the exact moment gravity took over." Hathaway stared at her, genuinely horrified by the sheer, calculating patience of her revenge. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't fought the divorce. She had simply retreated into the shadows, quietly polishing her weapon, waiting for the precise moment he was most vulnerable. "I'll buy it," Hathaway suddenly blurted out, a desperate, manic energy seizing him. He grabbed the titanium pen and the $50,000 check, violently shoving them aside. "I'll buy Onyx Innovations from you right now. Whatever Apex was going to pay me, I'll give you a massive cut. 50 million, 100 million. Just reinstate the license, Maya. Let the merger go through. We can both walk away rich." Maya laughed. It was a rich, warm sound that echoed off the high, glass-paneled ceilings. "Oh, Hathaway, you still don't understand the board you're playing on," she said, wiping a small tear of amusement from her eye. "You think Apex Global walked away from the merger because they don't want the technology anymore?" Hathaway froze. "What?" "Apex Global is a data logistics conglomerate," Maya explained, leaning forward, her eyes locking him in a dead stare. "They don't care about your branding, your sleek Silicon Valley office, or your bloated C-suite salaries. They only ever wanted the Aura algorithm. When their due diligence team discovered the IP anomaly, they didn't just walk away from you. She reached into the pocket of her linen trousers and pulled out her own sleek, matte black smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and slid it across the walnut table toward Hathaway. On the screen was an email from the CEO of Apex Global, stamped just 2 hours ago. To Maya Caldwell, CEO, Onyx Innovations, LLC. Subject: Finalization of acquisition terms. Maya, our board has officially approved the acquisition of the Onyx Holding Company and all associated IP for the sum of $2.8 billion in cash and stock options. We look forward to having you join us as Chief Technology Officer. Hathaway stared at the screen, the numbers blurring together as his stomach plummeted into an endless void. "They're not buying your company, Hathaway," Maya said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow. "They're buying mine." The silence in the room was no longer just heavy. It was a physical, suffocating force. It pressed against Hathaway's eardrums, a high-pitched, ringing vacuum that drowned out the faint trickle of the koi pond outside. He stared at the glowing screen of Maya's matte black smartphone, his eyes locking onto the digits in the email from the CEO of Apex Global. $2.8 billion. The numbers seemed to detach themselves from the screen, floating in the air, searing themselves into his retinas. It was a sum so vast, so staggeringly incomprehensible, that it short-circuited his brain's ability to process panic. For a terrifying, suspended moment, his mind simply went blank. The bespoke Tom Ford suit, tailored to perfection just weeks ago, suddenly felt like a straitjacket lined with lead. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs, like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a collapsing cage. He slowly looked up from the screen to Maya. She was sitting perfectly still, bathed in the soft, diffused afternoon light pouring through the massive structural glass skylight. She looked exactly like a queen sitting on a throne of reclaimed French oak and quiet, unassailable power. There was no gloating in her expression. There was only the clinical, satisfied stillness of an architect watching a perfectly designed demolition. They went behind my back," Hathaway stammered. The voice that came out of his throat did not belong to the billionaire CEO of Sterling Data Solutions. It was thin, reedy, and fractured, the voice of a child trying to explain a shattered vase. "Apex approached you? Without telling me?" "Business is business, Hathaway," Maya said, her rich alto voice echoing the exact sterile phrase he had used against her 5 years ago in the divorce settlement. She picked up her delicate bone china teacup and took a measured sip. When Apex's due diligence auditors pulled the floorboards up on Sterling Data, they realized they were buying an empty vessel carrying stolen, uninsured cargo. They did what any rational conglomerate would do to protect a multi-billion-dollar investment. They bypassed the middleman and went straight to the cargo's owner. She set the teacup down with a soft, deliberate clink that made Hathaway flinch. "They don't want your aggressive sales team," Maya continued, leaning forward slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his pale face. "They don't care about your sleek, leased corporate campus in Silicon Valley, or your bloated C-suite salaries, or the expensive PR firm that gets your face on the cover of Wired. They only ever wanted the Aura algorithm. It is the holy grail of predictive data sorting, and they are willing to pay the actual market value for the mind that built it." Grace, who had been sitting frozen like a mannequin beside Hathaway, suddenly snapped to life. Her perfectly manicured hands, weighed down by the stack of Cartier Love bracelets, gripped the edge of the live edge walnut table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Wait," Grace said, her voice shrill, tearing through the heavy atmosphere like a siren. She looked frantically between Hathaway's ghost-white face and Maya's serene one. Wait, Hathaway. Stop. What is she saying? Is she saying you don't own the company anymore? What about the IPO money? What about your shares? We are ringing the bell at the stock exchange next month. Hathaway couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at anything except his own hands, which were now shaking uncontrollably against the surface of the table. The shares, he whispered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. My God, the stock. When the SEC filing hits the wire, when the market finds out we lost the core, IP, and the merger collapsed. Your stock will be trading for pennies by the opening bell tomorrow, Maya finished for him. Her tone was completely devoid of malice, which somehow made the reality of it infinitely worse. It was just a factual observation, a mathematical certainty. Your board of directors will have a fiduciary duty to the remaining shareholders to remove you as chief executive officer immediately for gross negligence. You failed to secure the foundational intellectual property of your own company before taking it public. That is corporate fraud, Hathaway. You will be locked out of the building, your corporate accounts will be frozen, and your personal assets will be heavily scrutinized before your Maybach even crosses the George Washington Bridge. Grace stood up so fast, her Hans Wegner wishbone chair scraped violently against the reclaimed wood floor. The harsh sound echoed up to the 20-foot ceiling. Are you bankrupt? Grace demanded, her voice rising a full octave. The carefully cultivated, soft-spoken influencer persona was entirely gone, vaporized by raw, unfiltered panic. Hathaway, look at me. Tell me she is lying. I just signed the final lease agreement on the St. Regis estate in Aspen for the wedding. The catering deposit was $100,000 and it is non-refundable. The flights to Milan for my dress fitting. She looked down at her wrists, shaking the heavy gold bracelets as if they had suddenly turned into iron shackles. Grace, please, Hathaway begged, finally tearing his eyes away from his trembling hands to look up at her. His face was a mask of sheer terror. I can fix this. I know people. I can secure emergency private equity. I have favors I can call in. I can build something else. We just have to weather the storm. Build something else, Grace shrieked, backing away from the magnificent dining table, as if Hathaway were suddenly radiating a deadly virus. Are you insane? You're 46 years old and you just lost $4 billion in 10 minutes because you didn't read a contract. I am 23 years old, Hathaway. I have brand deals. I am not spending the best years of my life helping you build in some cramped, rented apartment while you fight federal lawsuits and SEC investigations. Maya watched the performance with mild academic interest. She rested her chin on her hand, observing the spectacular implosion of Hathaway's carefully curated life. It was better than any prestige drama on television, entirely unscripted and thoroughly deserved. You're leaving, Hathaway gasped, standing up on shaky legs, reaching a hand out toward his fiancée. Right now? After everything? You're just walking out? Everything? Grace scoffed, her face contorting with disgust. She snatched her pristine white Chanel tweed jacket off the back of her chair and clutched her quilted leather purse defensively to her chest. Everything was the lifestyle, Hathaway. You told me you were a titan of industry. You told me she was a nobody who couldn't keep up with your genius. Grace pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Maya, who remained completely unfazed. She has a custom koi pond in Brooklyn that costs more than my entire life, Grace yelled at him. You're a fraud, Hathaway. You're a complete fake. Without waiting for a response, Grace spun on her red-soled Louboutins and practically sprinted down the dimly lit, raw plaster hallway. A moment later, the heavy, 1890s wooden front door slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled the doorframe. Hathaway stood frozen at the table, staring down the empty corridor. In the span of less than half an hour, he had been systematically stripped of his multi-billion-dollar empire, his professional reputation, his staggering net worth, and his future wife. He slowly turned back to Maya. The arrogant swagger, the predatory confidence, the polished veneer of the Silicon Valley conqueror. It was all entirely gone. He looked broken, hollowed out, a mere shell of the man who had confidently knocked on her door earlier that afternoon. He fell back heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A wretched, guttural sound escaped his throat. "Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate sob he couldn't suppress. "Maya, please. I am begging you. You've made your point. You've humiliated me in front of Grace. You've destroyed my company. I understand. I was wrong. But please, don't take absolutely everything. Give me a licensing deal, a fraction of a percent, anything to pacify the board. If I walk out of here with nothing, they will personally sue me into oblivion. I'll lose the Manhattan penthouse. I'll lose my personal accounts. I will be ruined." Maya looked at the weeping man across from her. She actively searched her heart for a shred of pity, a lingering ghost of the profound affection she had once held for the ambitious, bright-eyed graduate student she had married a decade ago. But there was nothing there. The well was completely dry. There was only the cold, clean, mathematical architecture of justice. 5 years ago, Hathaway, I sat across from you in a sterile mediation room in Midtown, Maya said softly, her voice carrying a quiet, devastating finality that cut right through his sobbing. I didn't ask you for half of the company I helped you build. I didn't ask to bleed you dry. I asked for a fair share, just enough to start over, comfortably and securely. She paused, letting the memory fill the space between them. And you looked me dead in the eye, Maya continued, with your 3 aggressive corporate lawyers flanked behind you like bodyguards. And you laughed. You told me that my lack of vision was a liability. You told me that business is a zero-sum game. You said, "To the victor, go the spoils, Maya, and the weak get exactly what they deserve." Maya stood up from the walnut table. She stood tall, radiant, and utterly unbothered by the wreckage at her feet. "You set the rules of this game, Hathaway," Maya said, looking down at him with eyes as hard as obsidian. "I didn't cheat. I just played your game infinitely better than you did. Now, I highly suggest you take your $50,000 check and leave my home. My contractors are arriving at 8 a.m. tomorrow to install the climate controls for the new wine cellar, and I genuinely do not want your negative energy lingering in the foundation of my house." Hathaway did not say another word. He couldn't. His throat felt as though it had been packed with dry sand. The silence in Maya's immaculate, sun-drenched living room pressed against his eardrums, heavier than the crushing gravity of the billions he had just lost. He looked down at the walnut dining table. Sitting next to the useless, unsigned stack of legal documents was the certified cashier's check for $50,000. Only an hour ago, he had pulled it from his bespoke jacket pocket, feeling like a benevolent god tossing a coin to a beggar. Now, looking at the crisp paper and the neatly printed zeros, a nauseating wave of realization washed over him. That piece of paper, drawn from his personal discretionary account rather than corporate funds, was likely the only liquid asset he would have left by the end of the week. With fingers that trembled violently, Hathaway slowly reached out. He picked up the check. He didn't look at Maya as he folded it in half, then into quarters, and slid it into the breast pocket of his Tom Ford suit. It felt entirely weightless, yet it dragged his posture down like a lead weight. He turned away from the table, his legs moving with the stiff, shuffling gait of a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. The walk down the dimly lit, raw plaster hallway felt agonizingly long. When he had first walked down this corridor, he had viewed the exposed brick and dust as evidence of Maya's pathetic, stagnant life. Now he understood the truth. It was the entryway to a fortress. He was the one who had been living in a fragile glass house, and she had just thrown a boulder through the roof. Hathaway reached the heavy wooden front door. He grasped the antique brass handle, pulled it open, and stepped out onto the Brooklyn stoop. The crisp, late October air hit his face, smelling of exhaust, roasted nuts, and impending rain. The world outside had not stopped. Delivery trucks rumbled past, a group of teenagers laughed loudly on the opposite corner, and the bodega neon sign buzzed aggressively. Everything was exactly as it had been. Yet, Hathaway's entire universe had just been fundamentally erased. He looked toward the curb, expecting to see the sleek, obsidian black silhouette of his 2025 Mercedes Maybach waiting to whisk him away from this nightmare. He needed the climate-controlled cabin. He needed the tinted windows to hide his face. The curb was empty. Hathaway blinked, stepping down the peeling concrete stairs. "Thomas?" he croaked, looking frantically up and down McDonough Street. There was an old Toyota Camry parked where his $500,000 car had been idling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was already lit up like a Christmas tree, vibrating continuously with an unyielding stream of notifications. He ignored the missed calls and immediately opened his text messages, searching for his driver. There was a message from Thomas, sent 5 minutes ago. "Mr. Sterling. Miss DuPont informed me of the situation regarding the company's sudden insolvency. She instructed me to drive her immediately to JFK Airport. She mentioned a non-refundable first-class ticket to Milan she booked on your American Express. Furthermore, considering the news breaking on Bloomberg regarding the SEC investigation into Sterling Data Solutions, I am formally submitting my resignation, effective immediately. I will leave the Maybach keys with the valet at the airport. Best of luck." Hathaway stared at the glowing text, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Grace had not just left him. She had commandeered his vehicle and was actively fleeing the country on his dime before his credit lines could be frozen. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his state of shock. He needed to get out of Bedford-Stuyvesant. He needed to get to his penthouse in Manhattan before the board of directors changed the locks. He opened his Uber app, his thumb shaking so badly he could barely tap the screen. He selected an Uber black SUV, typed in his Tribeca address, and hit confirm. A red banner flashed across the top of his screen. Payment method declined. Please update your billing information. No, 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 Hathaway muttered, tapping the screen frantically. He tried his corporate platinum card. Declined. He tried his personal black card. Declined. The corporate freeze had already begun. The board of directors wasn't just firing him. They were severing every financial artery he possessed. As he stood stranded on the cracked pavement, his phone began to vibrate with a new, terrifying intensity. The digital avalanche had arrived. Hathaway watched, paralyzed, as the push notifications cascaded down his lock screen in real time. Wall Street Journal. Breaking. Apex Global withdraws $4.2 billion. Acquisition of Sterling Data Solutions, citing massive IP fraud. Bloomberg Markets. Trading halted on Nasdaq for STDS pending SEC emergency inquiry. Stock plummets 82% in pre-market after-hours trading. Text message. David Kensington, General Counsel. Hathaway. Do not return to the office. Do not speak to the press. The board has retained independent litigation counsel. You are personally liable for the IP misrepresentation. I am so sorry, but I have to recuse myself." Finally, an email notification popped up. It was from Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless 70-year-old chairman of the board for Sterling Data Solutions. The subject line was capitalized and devoid of any corporate politeness. Immediate termination for cause and notice of pending litigation. Hathaway didn't even need to open the email to know what it said. They were stripping him of his title, his remaining equity, and his golden parachute. They were going to feed him to the federal regulators to save themselves. His fingers went numb. The sleek, titanium-backed iPhone slipped from his grasp. It hit the concrete sidewalk with a sharp crack, the expensive screen shattering into a dense spiderweb of fractured glass. The screen flickered, showing one last notification from a news outlet, before going completely dark. Hathaway Sterling, the man who had woken up that morning as a titan of Silicon Valley, did not bend down to pick it up. He simply turned his collar up against the biting autumn wind, shoved his hands into his empty pockets, and began to walk aimlessly down the Brooklyn street, swallowed by the shadows of the very neighborhood he had come to mock. Back inside the brownstone, the heavy wooden door had shut with a solid, satisfying thud. Maya Caldwell stood in the dimly lit entryway for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of her home. The intrusive, frantic energy Hathaway had brought into her sanctuary had been entirely expunged. The air felt lighter, cleaner. She walked slowly back into the massive, sun-drenched living room. The afternoon light pouring through the structural glass skylight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into tiny, floating diamonds. She moved toward the stunning walnut dining table, her eyes falling on the single bone china teacup she had been drinking from, and the empty space where Hathaway's desperate $50,000 check had laid. Maya picked up the teacup and carried it into her pristine, matte black kitchen. She poured the remaining cold Darjeeling tea down the polished marble sink, watching the dark amber liquid swirl and vanish down the drain. It was a simple, mundane action, but it felt profoundly ceremonial. 5 years of waiting, of quiet planning, of enduring the condescension of a man who had stolen her brilliance, had just been washed away. She walked over to the massive retractable glass doors at the back of the room and slid them open. The cool breeze swept in, rustling the leaves of the bamboo stalks in her private courtyard. She stepped out onto the reclaimed wood deck, walking over to the edge of the Japanese koi pond. She watched the massive, vibrant orange and white fish glide silently beneath the surface of the dark water. They moved with absolute purpose, never rushing, never thrashing. They simply navigated their environment with ancient, unbothered grace. Maya had spent hours sitting by this pond over the last 5 years, using its tranquility to center her mind, while she meticulously crafted the legal and digital traps that had just sprung flawlessly. Her phone, resting on the kitchen island, chimed with a soft, melodic tone. Maya turned, walking back inside. She picked up the sleek, matte black device and looked at the screen. It was a secure text message from Robert Hayes, the CEO of Apex Global. Maya. The final contracts have been fully executed by our legal team and filed with the regulatory boards. The wire transfer for the initial $1.4 billion liquid payout will hit your private accounts at 9 a.m. tomorrow when the banks open. The remaining stock options will vest according to the schedule we agreed upon. A second message immediately followed. I also saw the news breaking about Sterling Data. It is a bloodbath over there. You played a masterful game of chess, Maya. I am incredibly honored to have you joining our executive board as Chief Technology Officer. See you at dinner next Tuesday in Manhattan. Maya read the messages twice. The numbers, $1.4 billion in liquid cash, were astronomical, but they didn't induce the frantic, breathless panic that had consumed Hathaway. To Maya, the money was merely a metric of her code's value. It was undeniable, mathematical proof that her mind was the true architect of the empire. She typed a brief, elegant reply. Thank you, Robert. The code is secure, and the transition will be seamless. Looking forward to Tuesday. She locked her phone and set it down next to the gleaming La Marzocco espresso machine. She reached for a fresh portafilter, ground a dose of dark roast Ethiopian beans, and began to steam milk for a latte. The hiss of the steam wand filled the quiet kitchen, a warm, comforting sound. Maya looked around her magnificent, multi-million-dollar fortress. She had built this life brick by brick, line of code by line of code, in the absolute silence of her own genius. Hathaway had come to burn it down, completely unaware that he was standing on a floor coated in gasoline, holding the very match that would immolate his own life. She poured the steamed milk over the rich, dark espresso, creating a perfect, symmetrical Rosetta pattern in the foam. Taking the ceramic mug in her hands, she let the heat warm her palms. She took a sip, closed her eyes, and smiled. The ghost in the machine had finally been laid to rest, and for the first time in a decade, the architecture of her life belonged entirely to her. The spectacular downfall of Hathaway Sterling became a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley for years to come. It was a stark reminder that arrogance is a brittle foundation, and that true power does not roar from the back of a luxury car. It moves silently, building leverage in the shadows. Hathaway, blinded by his own ego and the superficial trappings of wealth, severely underestimated the quiet brilliance of the woman he discarded. He mistook her silence for surrender, never realizing that an architect doesn't need to scream to build a fortress. Maya Caldwell's triumph was not born of sudden vengeance, but of meticulous, patient strategy. She proved that while deceit can build a temporary empire, only undeniable substance can sustain it. In the end, the billionaire lost everything, not because he was outspent, but because he was profoundly, irreversibly outsmarted by a mind he thought he owned.